Thank you. Can everyone hear me? Okay, good. It has been a really good day. It's been a long day. I understand that. My assignment is to make it somewhat longer. I'll try to make it not too much longer, but I have been asked by the translator to not speak too rapidly, and that's very difficult for me. I'm trying very deliberately to speak slowly now, but I doubt that it will last. My father used to tell me to just slow down, and I never did. So anyway, it's an honor to be here. It's exciting to be here speaking in Sweden. My own background is Danish and Norwegian, so I felt a little bit at risk coming to Sweden, but there's a good-sized Norwegian contingent here. At least I think they haven't left yet, so I should be safe. Anyway, I want to talk about what I see as the fundamental issue in Christianity, the fundamental point of Christianity. I was asked when I was invited to come here to see if I could speak about something to do with Christ, finding Christ in the Book of Mormon. The fundamental idea of Christianity, I think this is a good note in some ways to end the conference on, is the idea that God, first of all, exists, but secondly, that God is not a distant absentee landlord, that God is intimately involved in this world. Specifically, that God the Son took upon himself a physical body and came and lived here among us in this world. He knows what we go through because he went through it. In some mysterious way, he went through what all of us are going through, not merely individually, but together, collectively, certainly as part of the atonement. But he knows what it's like to be tired, to be hungry, to walk long distances, to be rejected, and so on. Now, this idea of Christianity, that God came to earth and took upon himself flesh, the incarnation of God, is under attack. And I would say that the principal threat faced by the church today is not so much what it used to be when I was growing up, I think, and that was alternate forms of Christianity. Evangelical Christians and so on who are not overly fond of us. They're still not. But the fundamental issue that we deal with now in our modern society is secularism. It's the idea that there is no God, that God did not send his Son, because there isn't a God, first of all, and Jesus was a good teacher, or something like that. Or even in some radical cases, the idea is that Jesus never existed, that he's not a real person. He's a fictional character. And so I want to talk about the Book of Mormon's relevance to that issue. Yesterday, coming over here, we drove, my wife and I, from Uppsala to Göteborg here. We passed by Husaby, for example, a very historic place where the first Christian king of Sweden was baptized, according to tradition. Now, Sweden has changed a bit since then. In some ways, Sweden is returning, much of the West is returning to Gamla Uppsala, the old part, the pagan part, the pre-Christian part. Some have talked about Europe as being post-Christian. There's a joke, and I hate to pick on the Swedes, but I will a little bit. Sweden is sort of the model secular country in the West now. And there's a famous Austrian-American sociologist by the name of Peter Berger who's made a quip. He says, look, if Sweden is the most secular country in the world and India is the most religious country in the world, then America is something of a hybrid. It's a country of Indians ruled by Swedes. But one of the most popular, I've been alarmed to see it, one of the most popular ideas, and apparently some polling indicates it's especially popular in Scandinavia, is this notion that Jesus did not exist at all. So there's no God, there was no resurrection. This is, by the way, I think, a crazy idea. I don't know of any really reputable historian who believes that Jesus didn't exist. Even unbelieving historians believe there was a historical person. Maybe he's grown into legend, but he was a real person. But you go to real extremes when you say there simply was no person like that. A number of years ago, back in the 60s and 70s, there was a sort of crazy British New Testament scholar who argued that there was no Jesus, that the name Jesus was a code word for a mushroom that made people high. It was like LSD. It was considered crazy then, but it'll probably come back now as a popular idea. Anyway, so the fundamental question that we have to deal with, I suppose, is there a God? But then specifically, is Jesus the divine Son of God? Did he rise from the dead? Well, part of the problem with this issue is that for a lot of people, they say, well, it's old texts recorded by primitive people, sort of superstitious. They didn't really understand how the world works. They didn't know about modern science. And so they thought that Jesus rose from the dead. They thought that he was divine. This, again, strikes me as a very weak argument. Ancient people were not scientific in our modern sense, but they weren't stupid. They knew that when dead bodies die, they don't typically come back to life. They had direct experience with that. They knew what death was. They're not making a scientific statement when they say that Jesus rose from the dead. They're saying, we saw him. We talked with him. We had personal experiences with him after he was dead. We saw him die on the cross. We saw him alive 3 days later. But still you can argue, well, if these things happened in ancient times, why don't they happen now? And the Book of Mormon is partly an answer to that question. The Lord removes the ambiguity, the unclarity in the historical record by giving us the Book of Mormon. He makes the choices clear. We don't have to depend on sifting through ancient texts where we don't know the languages perfectly well and there are gaps in the manuscripts and so on. We don't have to reconstruct an ancient culture that is imperfectly understood, that's long vanished and very foreign to us. The question is a yes or no question. And in modern times, the Lord has given us an answer to this with the Book of Mormon. Specifically, I'm going to quote from section 20 and how it describes the Book of Mormon, section 20 of the Doctrine and Covenants. It talks about the Book of Mormon, it says, which contains the record of a fallen people and the fullness of the gospel of Jesus Christ to the Gentiles and to the Jews also, which was given by inspiration and is confirmed to others by the ministering of angels and is declared unto the world by them, proving to the world that the Holy Scriptures are true and that God does inspire men and call them to his holy work in this age and generation, as well as in generations of old, thereby showing that he is the same God yesterday, today, and forever. So the question, why, if it happened in ancient times, doesn't it happen today, is answered in a way with the Book of Mormon, which says it does happen today. And the Book of Mormon constitutes a separate witness confirming the truth of the Bible, which might not have been so important in Joseph Smith's day, when most people, certainly in America, believed in the Bible. But today, in a time when the Bible is seen by many as just a book of old Iron Age fables, primitive goat herders from Palestine who didn't really know anything, the Book of Mormon says, no, the Bible account is fundamentally true. So here are some things the Book of Mormon confirms for us. The authors of the Book of Mormon knew in advance that Jesus would come to earth and take upon himself a physical body, and they knew the approximate time of his coming. Several saw him before he came into mortality. They knew his name or title, Jesus Christ. They knew the name of his mother and the fact that she was a virgin. They knew the place of his birth. They foresaw his baptism, including its location and other specific details of the ministry of John the Baptist. They knew that he would call 12 apostles to assist in his ministry. King Benjamin prophesied of his many miracles. They expected his atoning death by crucifixion, knowing also of the 3 days of darkness that would intervene before his resurrection. They understood the sacrifices of the law of Moses as foreshadowing his sacrifice. The Book of Mormon confirms the authenticity of many of the sayings attributed to Jesus in the New Testament Gospels. It confirms the unity of the Sermon on the Mount. It confirms his pain in the Garden of Gethsemane and his resurrection on the third day. It is, thus, a second witness to the essential truth of the New Testament Gospels. Now, what does it say? You can look at various places and see specifically what, I didn't go far enough with that quote. You can look at the title page of the Book of Mormon, which says what the purpose of the book is. One of the most important elements of the point of the Book of Mormon is this. It says, It comes forth to the convincing of the Jew and Gentile that Jesus is the Christ, the eternal God, manifesting himself unto all nations. There are several things we could say. I won't take time to talk about this slide. You probably have heard about the phenomenon or the literary technique known as chiasmus. A chiasm or a chiasm in Greek, it's a Greek term, is a literary structure in which you mention certain items in a list in a certain order and then repeat that list in reverse order. A, B, C, C, B, A. Sometimes you want to make a really important point, you put that in the middle, A, B, C, D, C, B, A. And a person growing up in a culture who understands chiasmus will understand that D, that center point, is the most important thing. Alma 36, and I recommend if you want to study this that you just Google Alma 36 chiasmus. That's spelled C-H-I-A-S-M-U-S. You'll see various statements of it and outlines. This is one that we found online very easily last night. But right in the middle of it, you can see it there. I remembered Jesus Christ, a Son of God. I cried, Jesus Christ, Son of God. Okay? That is the center point. This chapter is literally centered, as the Book of Mormon is figuratively centered, on Jesus Christ. So that's another aspect of the Book of Mormon's witness. The most important event in the Book of Mormon, of course, is the appearance of Christ to the people of the New World, indicating again, if it's true, that Jesus really did rise from the dead. Otherwise, how could he have appeared to people in the New World in a post-resurrection state? So this is tremendously important. And some observers now outside the church are recognizing how centered the Book of Mormon is on Jesus Christ. For example, a recent book by John Turner, it's just been published. He is a non-Mormon historian who's written a biography of Brigham Young. John Turner says he was stunned to realize how Christ-centered the Book of Mormon is. Or the late friend of some of us, Stephen Webb, a philosopher, a Catholic philosopher who died just a few months ago. Stephen wrote a book in which he commented on his own experience with the Book of Mormon and said the Book of Mormon was obsessed with Christ, saturated with Christ. So those who say that Mormons are not Christians have to deal with the fact that the Book of Mormon is a very literally Christ-centered book. And it testifies, for example, that there is no other way nor means whereby man can be saved, only through the atoning blood of Jesus Christ. But here the question is the Book of Mormon true? If it's not an independent witness, then that witness has no great value. If it's simply Joseph Smith writing a book about his faith in Jesus, then it has no value as proof for the stories of the New Testament. But if it's true, if it really is ancient scripture, then it becomes an essential, remarkably valuable, second confirming witness to the testimony of the Book of Mormon. So I want to offer some evidence for the Book of Mormon. First, I'll offer Joseph Smith himself. This is what Emma Smith had to say about her own husband's limited education. She remarked of her husband Joseph's limited education while he was translating the Book of Mormon, and she was scribe at the time. He could not pronounce the word Sariah. And one time while translating, where it speaks of the walls of Jerusalem, he stopped and said, "Emma, did Jerusalem have walls surrounding it?" When I informed him it had, he replied, "Oh, I thought I was deceived." See, Joseph was not capable of writing the Book of Mormon, but I want to make another point here before I move on. Joseph, one of the things that's occurred to me in recent years in thinking about Joseph's story is it's very clear to me that Joseph was surprised by what he found in the Book of Mormon. There he was reading it out, translating it, dictating it to his scribe, but he doesn't know what's coming next. He runs into names that he can't pronounce. He has to spell them to the scribe. He doesn't know certain of the elements. He's surprised by the walls of Jerusalem. He didn't write this book. And remember, in many cases, he seems, according to testimony, to be translating the Book of Mormon with his head in a hat. Now, critics have had a lot of fun with that. They say, how stupid, how silly, how superstitious. But here's one thing I'll say about it. If you have your head in a hat, the purpose is to exclude the light so that you can see. He's looking at a dim object, the seer stone. He can't see it very clearly. He's doing this hours a day. It's like working on a computer. You don't put it in front of an open window, right, with the light coming in your face. You put some darkness around it so you can see the screen better. He puts the stone in this hat, and then he reads it off. What that does tell you is he can't be reading from a manuscript. The hat is too small. He wouldn't be able to see the manuscript anyway. So you have a couple of choices. Either he's really translating from a glowing object in there, or he's making it up at the rate of 8.5 or 11 pages, printed pages in the English edition, every day for 2 months. And he has 2 months of education, right? This is a barely literate young man. That's a remarkable thing. He doesn't know anything. He doesn't know that Jerusalem had walls. And yet he's able to produce the Book of Mormon off the top of his head, just dictating it. First draft, he never revises it. I'm sorry, I could not do this. And when I hear people say, oh yes, he just had a good imagination, I think, well, good. Do it. Just try. Okay. So, it's a remarkable thing. Now, I'll say something else. His honesty and his sincerity shine through in his personal writings. If this was not an honest man who really believed what he was doing, then I am no judge of humanity. You read the personal writings of Joseph Smith as they're now coming out, and I think his sincerity, his deep religious devotion are obvious. But I want to read some things from other people. You've heard it mentioned that I'm connected with something called the Interpreter Foundation. This is something up on our website. This is the only authentic image of Oliver Cowdery. Now, it's been colorized. One of the people working with us did the color, but this is a daguerreotype. It's before there was real photography of Oliver Cowdery. We're pretty sure this is him. This is what he looked like. But here's a story told about Oliver Cowdery of a statement he made before a court. When he was practicing as an attorney, he was out of the church, and his opposing attorney revealed that he was one of the witnesses of the Book of Mormon, which the other attorney thought would discredit him in the eyes of the jury. They would say, this man is not to be taken seriously. Does Oliver Cowdery apologize? Does he say, no, that was another Oliver Cowdery, that's not me, or I'm sorry, I was deceived? No, he doesn't. According to this account, this is what he said. May it please the court and the gentlemen of the jury, my brother attorney on the other side has charged me with connection with Joseph Smith and the Golden Bible. The responsibility has been placed upon me, and I cannot escape reply. Before God and man, I dare not deny what I have said, and what my testimony contains, and as written and printed on the front page of the Book of Mormon. May it please your honor and gentlemen of the jury, this I say, I saw the angel and heard his voice. How can I deny it? It happened in the daytime, when the sun was shining bright in the firmament, not in the night when I was asleep. That glorious messenger from heaven, dressed in white, standing above the ground, in a glory I have never seen anything to compare, with the sun insignificant in comparison, told us, if we denied that testimony, there is no forgiveness in this life nor in the world to come. Now, how can I deny it? I dare not. I will not. Another of the witnesses, the last one to survive, David Whitmer, again in an authentic image of him in his old age, colorized. On the day following his death in 1888, the Chicago Times newspaper reported an interview with an unnamed man. It just called the man the Chicago Man. And this man related a conversation that he'd had with another individual some years before, a prominent resident of the county in Missouri where David Whitmer lived. He had been a lawyer and a sheriff there, and he knew David Whitmer very well. And he told a remarkable story, and this is what he had to say, as quoted in the Chicago Times. No man in Missouri possessed greater courage or honesty, and that's important, honesty, than this heroic old man, David Whitmer. His oath, he said, would send a man to the gallows quicker than that of any man I ever knew. Now, what does that mean? He means that in even serious cases, matters of life and death, David Whitmer's word would be taken as true. If he said it, it was true. You could depend upon it. He had a reputation as an honest man. He then went on to say that no person had ever questioned his word, to his knowledge, about any other matter than finding the Book of Mormon. He, again talking about David Whitmer, he was always a loser and never a gainer by adhering to the faith of Joseph Smith. Why persons should question his word about the golden plates when they took it in relation to all other matters was to him a mystery. The question is, why on earth would David Whitmer stick by this story unless he sincerely believed it? Now, by the way, let me just say that some people have suggested to me that David Whitmer only stayed by his testimony to the Book of Mormon because he was afraid of Brigham Young. Brigham Young would have had him killed, right, if he had ever dared to deny his testimony. Well, here's one problem with that. Brigham Young died in 1877. David Whitmer died in 1888. He has 11 years to tell the truth, right? But in his view, he is telling the truth. And you can go to his tomb, his grave, in Richmond, Missouri, and you see there's a shaft of stone about so tall standing on his grave. And on top of it are 2 books carved. This was by order of David Whitmer. He designed his own grave. The 2 books are clearly the Bible and the Book of Mormon. And on his tomb, it says, "The record of the Jews and the record of the Nephites are one." So David Whitmer is not only not scared of Brigham Young, he bears his testimony after death. He has that engraved on his tomb because he believes it to be true. This is a man who was honest to a fault. He was actually difficult to get along with because he stood by what he believed in. He stood by the Book of Mormon, even literally under threat of death. This is an interview with Orson Pratt and Joseph F. Smith. "I saw the plates and other artifacts just as plain as I see this bed." And then he strikes his hand upon the bed beside him. "And I heard the voice of the Lord as distinctly as I ever heard anything in my life, declaring that the records of the plates of the Book of Mormon were translated by the gift and power of God." Here's another interview with Joseph Smith III, the son of Joseph Smith, who comes there with not only some people from the new reorganized LDS Church, but also with some non-Mormons, one by the name of Colonel Giles. Rather suggestively, he says, Colonel Giles asked if it might not have been possible that he, Mr. Whitmer, had been mistaken and had simply been moved upon by some mental disturbance or hallucination, which had deceived them into thinking he saw the personage, the angel, the plates, the Urim and Thummim, and the sword of Laban. How well and distinctly I remember the manner in which Elder Whitmer arose and drew himself up to his full height, a little over 6 feet, and said in solemn and impressive tones, "No, sir, I was not under any hallucination, nor was I deceived. I saw with these eyes, and I heard with these ears. I know whereof I speak." All right, pretty firm testimony. And I could quote many, many more than these, but I'm just giving you a taste of it to suggest that we're not dependent only on ancient testimony, ancient apostles, barbaric Stone Age people, but people who lived within relatively recent times, who've said similar things or seen similar things and borne eyewitness testimony. They're not talking about deductions from science. They're talking about what they saw, okay? What about the witness of Joseph's family? Here's a picture late in life of William Smith, the prophet's younger brother. And this is what he has to say, what William Smith has to say, who knew Joseph intimately well. "There was not a single member of the family of sufficient age to know right from wrong, but what had implicit confidence in the statements made by my brother Joseph concerning his vision, and the knowledge he thereby obtained concerning the plates. Father and mother believed him. Why should not the children? I suppose if he had told crooked stories about other things, we might have doubted his word about the plates. But Joseph was a truthful boy. That father and mother believed his report and suffered persecution for that belief shows that he was truthful." And that's absolutely true. They suffered greatly because of their faith in Joseph Smith. Their son, I mean, you parents or older brothers, if your little brother or your son who had a history of lying to you came to you and told you a tall story like this, would you be willing to give up your house? Would you be willing to face death, to go out walking through the snow in the dead of winter for hundreds of miles on behalf of that son or that brother? You'd have to really believe him to do that. And they did. They showed it not just by word, but also by the way they acted. Here's his sister, Catherine Smith Salisbury. When she first saw the Book of Mormon, she was convinced that without God's guidance, her brother could not have brought forth such a work. "I can testify to the fact of the coming forth of the Book of Mormon," she affirmed, "and also to its truth, and the truth of the everlasting gospel is contained therein. Many times when I've read its sacred pages, I've wept like a child, while the Spirit has borne witness with my spirit of its truth. Now, she was one of the witnesses. It's not often known, but she actually held the plates. She had to carry them and hide them when Joseph was being chased by a mob at one point. Or the witness of Joseph's older brother, Hiram. This is an image of Joseph cradling Hiram after Hiram has been shot in the face at Carthage jail. Hiram talks about his willingness to suffer martyrdom. Remember, the Greek word martyr, martyros, means witness. Not just someone who dies for a faith or a belief, but a person who is a witness. Hiram talked about his willingness to go to death for the principle, and in fact he did, and knew that he was going to, I think, a few days before it happened. This is what he said after being kept for nearly 6 months at Liberty Jail in terrible conditions. I had been abused and thrust into a dungeon and confined for months on account of my faith and the testimony of Jesus Christ. However, I thank God that I felt a determination to die rather than deny the things which my eyes had seen, which my hands had handled, and which I had borne testimony to. And I can assure my beloved brethren that I was enabled to bear as strong a testimony when nothing but death presented itself as ever I did in my life. Now, as I say, he would have occasion to go on and actually die, knowing that he was going probably to his death in Carthage jail, which again talks about the faith that the family had in Joseph Smith and his account of the angels and the plates. And he himself was one of the 8 witnesses. Then Emma Smith. What did she go through? Well, here's an image of Emma carrying her children while Joseph is in Liberty Jail from Missouri under an extermination order by the governor of that state. Did she pay a price for her faith in Joseph Smith? Yes, she did. And this is what she had to say, one of her testimonies. The Book of Mormon is of divine authenticity. I have not the slightest doubt of it. I am satisfied that no man could have dictated the writing of the manuscripts unless he was inspired. For when acting as a scribe, your father would dictate to me hour after hour, and when returning after meals or after interruptions, he would at once begin where he had left off, without either seeing the manuscript or having any portion of it read to him. This was a usual thing for him to do. It would have been improbable that a learned man could do this. And for one so ignorant and unlearned as he was, it was simply impossible. The plates often lay on the table without any attempt at concealment, wrapped in a small linen tablecloth, which I had given him to fold them in. I once felt of the plates as they thus lay on the table, tracing their outline and shape. They seemed to be pliable like thick paper, and would rustle with a metallic sound when the edges were moved by the thumb, as one sometimes thumbs the edges of a book. Now, I have to admit, I've always wanted to ask Emma a question. Emma says that she never looked at the plates, but she spent time alone with the plates, sitting there on the table. I know what I would have done. She says, I know he had the plates. She obviously spent quality time with the plates, touching them, moving the top plate against the one below it, feeling the rings and so on, feeling along the edge of it. It would have been just a small thing to lift up the cloth and take a look. But she says, I know that he had the plates, okay? Now, she's not the only one who had that experience. I mentioned Joseph's sister, Catherine. She did the same thing. She describes the sound of the metal of the plates, how heavy they were, and what they felt like with the rings and along the edge and all that sort of thing. Joseph felt quite comfortable leaving the plates in some places around his family, knowing that they could easily have lifted the thing and seen that there were no plates there. He's not worried about it because, from my point of view, there were plates there, okay? He's not scared about that. Joseph Knight, Jr. I'm proud of him. He's an ancestor of mine. This is what he had to say. In 1827, this is actually the winter of 1826 and 27, my father hired Joseph Smith. Joseph and I worked and slept together. My father said Joseph was the best hand he ever hired. We found him a boy of truth. He was about 21 years of age. I think it was in November 1826. He made known to my father and I that he had seen a vision, that a personage had appeared to him and told him where there was a gold book of ancient date buried, and if he would follow the directions of the angel, he could get it. We were told it in secret. My father and I believed what he told us. I think we were the first to believe, after his father's family, and I would add probably Martin Harris. At last he got the plates and rode in my father's wagon and carried them home. So there you have the testimony of people who knew him extremely well, his family, people who were closely associated with him, people that he worked with and roomed with, boarded with, and so on, all of whom paid considerable prices for their faith in him, their confidence in his word. So there's a lot more that I could say. I have spent a lot of time studying the Book of Mormon in what I see as its Middle Eastern context. The Book of Mormon reads to me like a true history. It has links with the Middle East that seem to me impossible to explain by any natural means. Joseph knows things about the ancient world that he should not know. I've wanted to write a book at some point called Joseph Smith's Greatest Hits, in which we would talk about the kinds of things that he gets right about the ancient world that he should not have gotten right as a young man who had only 2 months of very bad frontier education. And yet he turns out to be right, even in some places where he seemed at the time to be wrong. But what is important to me about this is that, again, valuable as I find the New Testament and the Bible to be, and I spent a lot of time learning biblical languages and so on, they're tremendously important. But we have modern reinforcement, modern corroboration. That's one of the most important things about the Restoration that didn't seem so important in the 19th century, when almost everybody believed in the Bible in the West. They assumed the Bible to be true. Now we no longer assume that. We live in a secular age. And the Book of Mormon is here to tell us, no, it's true still. After all, it is true. And the doubts that have been raised about the Bible are not valid. They don't undercut its central claims. And so this is how I'll close. I'm trying to get you out of here not too long after 8, so we're just about done. This is the testimony, not even from the Book of Mormon, this is the testimony of Sidney Rigdon with Joseph Smith in the vision of the 3 degrees of glory. And now, after the many testimonies which have been given of him, this is the testimony last of all which we give of him, that he lives. For we saw him, even on the right hand of God, and we heard the voice bearing record that he is the only begotten of the Father. So this is modern testimony, not a deduction, a logical inference from ancient texts and manuscripts. This is eyewitness testimony that we can see in the clear light of relatively recent history, and we still have living witnesses. And it's not only Joseph Smith. One of the things that most strikes me about Joseph's story is that at almost every point where he has a crucial revelation, it's shared. The first vision is the exception, but the vision of the 3 degrees of glory, the restoration of the priesthood, the experience with the witnesses, these are shared experiences. It's Joseph Smith and others. You're not left just depending upon Joseph Smith's account, but you have other accounts as well. We have a cloud of witnesses. And that's important, using New Testament language. Wherefore, seeing we also are compassed about with so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which doth so easily beset us, and let us run with patience the race that is set before us. So we have strong reason to accept the most important message of Christianity, which is that there is a God and that he cares about us, that he sent his only begotten Son to sacrifice his life and atone for our sins, that Son was raised from the dead, that he came back to life, and that because of that, we have the possibility of being raised from the dead and returning to the presence of God and entering into celestial glory with him. It's a tremendous message. It's the most important message anybody can hear, the most important message we can convey to anyone else. I bear you my testimony that it's true. And if there's nothing else that we take away from this conference, I hope we will go away with renewed strength of conviction that the gospel can withstand criticism, that the gospel is true, that there is tremendously good news. That's, of course, what the word gospel means. There's tremendously good news that we have. We share much of it with the rest of Christendom, but we are given unusually strong grounds for believing in it. We have unusually strong reasons for knowing it to be true. And I testify to you that it is true, that in modern times, God has restored his church, has called a new prophet, has organized a church with apostles and living prophets, and I bear you that testimony in the name of the living Savior, Jesus Christ. Amen. Growing up in a family of Danish, Norwegian background, mostly Norwegian, this is my grandmother, I was raised with a lot of Swedish jokes. And I've mentioned to a couple here that my wife, actually her ancestry comes from this area of Sweden. And so when I met her grandmother the first time, she was delighted to see that my name was spelled S-O-N. So she said, "Oh, you must be Swedish." And I said, "No, actually I'm Danish and Norwegian." And then I proceeded to start telling her some jokes about Swedes, which I found she did not think were funny at all. I thought they were just, I know you can turn them around and tell them about anybody. But pretty soon my wife was telling me, my then fiance was telling me, "Look, stop telling these jokes or there won't be a wedding." So I quit. Anyway, so I grew up with those. Okay. Is there any testimony against Joseph's revelations and his translation of the Book of Mormon from people he knew? Well, of course there were people who didn't believe him. There were people who said, "Oh, he's an ignoramus, he's a person of no character." There was a set of affidavits, legal sworn statements that were gathered for the very first anti-Mormon book. And some of the claims they made were that the Smith family as a whole were lazy and didn't work and so on. And so this was obviously a scheme to make money. The funny thing is those affidavits have now been examined by historians. They don't do very well. Because, for example, there were 10 families who signed the affidavits saying that the Smith family were lazy, that they'd done no work on their farm. But you can compare that claim to the actual tax records of the period. And we know how much the Smith farm was worth, and they started it, from the beginning. They had to clear the land, clear the rocks. Of the 10 families, the Smith family farm was more valuable than 9 of the other family farms. There was only one family farm that was worth a little bit more, just slightly. So if you're looking at the Smiths as lazy, well, 9 of the 10 families who signed affidavits against them were lazier, okay? I mean, everywhere we can test them, we know that the affidavits are not true. We can estimate how many trees, how many thousands of trees they had to cut down, how many rocks, tons of rocks they had to move, and so on. This is not a lazy family. If they were lazy, then the rest of us are essentially dead, because they were doing physical labor of a kind that we just almost never have to do anymore. There is no testimony to say that Joseph didn't have plates. In fact, one of the ironic things is that Joseph's neighbors, almost all were convinced he did have the plates. They spent a lot of time trying to steal them from him. They were convinced he did have them. There are even other witnesses who said that they saw remnants of that stone box that was in the side of the hill Cumorah that had washed down into the valley after Joseph got the plates out of it. Obviously, there are people who disagree with Joseph, but these things come later when he becomes famous or notorious. William Smith has a really interesting comment. He says, we never knew that we were a really bad family until Joseph found the plates. And then neighbors began telling stories about them, and this can't be true, and so on and so forth. But I would say, although there's reason to, there are a lot of questions about the Book of Mormon we can't answer. So I don't want to say that it's a clear-cut case where nobody has any rational alternative but to believe in the Book of Mormon. I think the Lord doesn't want it to be in such a way that you're forced to believe against your will. But I don't see any good testimony against Joseph from his contemporaries, from the people he knew. Why Joseph Smith was a member of Freemason, he had a high degree. I think there were a couple of reasons. He was a Freemason because in those days, it's hard for us to imagine now, but the Freemasons, the Masonic order, were extremely popular in the United States. I mean, every president up through, I think, Dwight Eisenhower, there was only one exception, only one United States president who was not a member of the Freemasons. George Washington was. And it was an organization you belonged to get ahead in business, to have friends in the community, and so on. Joseph was trying everything he could to build relationships with other people in that community in Illinois. So he joined the Masonic Lodge and so on to try to build ties for his people. In the end, it didn't work. And many of the people involved in the mob who killed him were also Masons. But I think that was one of his principal reasons for joining the Masons. You spoke about Joseph's honesty and sincerity. Do you acknowledge that for a large part of his life, he was living a double life behind the back of his wife, the first presidency, and the average church members? On the issue of plural marriage, there is an issue there. I would say overwhelmingly he was an honest man. And I think that's quite clear. Sincerity is what I'm really getting at, even more than honesty, that he was genuinely religious. But on the matter of plural marriage, I think he was genuinely worried about what that would do. He is supposed to have said on occasion that he thought plural marriage would be the thing that got him killed, and he was probably right to a certain extent. He wasn't eager to tell people about it. I think he was, you've heard that the first revelation, the first understanding that plural marriage might be okay was about 1831, and yet the first plural marriage was 1835. That shows 4 years of hesitation on his part. I really don't think he wanted to make this public. I think it was very awkward. It's difficult for us in a time when sexual liberty is such an important article of faith for many people to understand what it was like to live in essentially a Victorian, I don't know if that concept means anything in Sweden, but in the English-speaking world it does, a very repressive place where relations between the sexes were very proper. To come in with an announcement of polygamy was a very unpleasant thing. It would not make you popular anywhere. And so I don't know why he didn't say anything, but I can well imagine it was that he didn't want to face the problems that would be entailed by it, including not telling his wife. That's awkward. Again, the Hales mentioned this. Why he'll have to explain that, I don't know the reason. Obviously, we can imagine one, that he just wants to sneak behind her back. But most of the marriages he did were actually done publicly. It's one thing to have an affair, a secret affair, but he didn't do that. He had the marriages solemnized with other people present, witnesses and so on. He's not trying to hide it. So there were a number of people who believed or who knew about plural marriage. It wasn't all hidden. But this is, I would say plural marriage is probably the single most difficult issue in LDS history. I'm sorry, I don't want to go on too much longer, but I want to say something about this. It all depends on the way you come to Joseph. Imagine a case where someone comes to you and says, I've heard something really negative about some person. If you don't know that person, if that's the only thing you've ever heard about that person, that bad thing will dominate your view of that person, right? That's all you know about him or her. You have no other good information or other information about that person. So on the other hand, if someone comes to you and says, I've heard something really negative about, and names a person that you've known for 40 years, you've always had good experiences with this person, this is a reliable, honest, good person, then you're much more inclined to say, well, there must be another side to this story, or maybe the story is not accurate. I certainly would like to talk to him about this. It's not going to affect your entire view. Now, obviously, if it's really bad and it turns out to be true, then eventually it might change your view of that person. But your first reaction is going to be very, very different. What I would argue is that with Joseph Smith, if you know a lot about him, and if what you see is good about him, there's a book I might recommend by a fellow by the name of McConkie. He's a son of Bruce McConkie, Mark McConkie, called Remembering Joseph, which is a collection, I think it's a wonderful collection of affidavits by people who knew Joseph Smith about his character, his personality, and so on. You read that, and he comes across as a really good man. The people who knew him best loved him most. And so then that helps you maybe to, it's not about plural marriage as such, but it might help you say, well, okay, I don't get plural marriage, but I'm willing to give him the benefit of the doubt, as we say in English. I'm willing to allow him something. Maybe I don't understand. If you've come to a decision that he's a bad guy, then of course it's going to change your view and make it even worse. Okay. This is really a question for the Hales. How do you reconcile Joseph Smith convincing young girls 14 to 20 to marry him by promising exaltation to whole households or threatening that an angel would kill him with a sword if they didn't comply with an honest and faithful God-fearing man? I don't know if the Hales are still here, but okay.
That's false.
Thank you. The authoritative word, that's false. That's what I was going to say, but you put it so much more eloquently. Yeah, it's just not true. I mean, this is the kind of propaganda you get, but it's not true. This is why it's so important to read the accurate history. On the night that Joseph Smith brought the plates home from Hill Cumorah, a friendly witness, Josiah Stoll, described getting a glimpse of the plates when bumping into Joseph Smith. He said they resembled a stone of greenish cast. This seems to correlate with Dan Vogel's theory on the plates being a physical object, but copper plates made by Joseph Smith. What are your thoughts on this? Yeah, I think it's really important. I just learned about Josiah Stoll's experience just recently and add him as another witness to the Book of Mormon. He thought they looked greenish. I'm wondering what kind of light he was seeing them in. It was nighttime. I don't know if he got a really good look at them. Dan Vogel's usual theory is the place didn't exist and the witnesses were all hallucinating. But he has a sub-theory, since that theory is stupid, that Joseph made a set of plates. And I always want to ask, okay, Dan, and I know Dan well, I've known him for years, when did he make them? Who made the plates? Where'd they go? Do you realize how much a gold-looking set of copper-based plates would have cost? That's hundreds of thousands of dollars in contemporary U.S. money. Because we're talking about an object of 40 to 60 pounds, usually 60 pounds. So what, 20 kilos or thereabouts? Or no, 30 kilos. So Dan Vogel's theory to me has enormous problems. After finishing the translation of the Book of Mormon, Joseph seldom read or taught from it, while he often used the Bible. What are your thoughts on this? That's a really interesting question, and here's my speculation on it. To me, this is evidence that Joseph did not write the book. The book was a gift handed to him, and he didn't. You've all probably had the experience of having a gift given to you, and you don't recognize the value of the gift for some time. I think that's what happened here. The case that suggested this to me was it's something else. It's section 76 of the Doctrine and Covenants, where Joseph Smith has the vision of the 3 degrees of glory. Grant Underwood, a historian now at BYU, has worked a lot on Joseph's intellectual history, and he was struck by the fact that Joseph didn't make anything of that vision. That's received very early, February 1832. It's almost 10 years later that Joseph begins talking about the 3 degrees of glory a lot. Well, there again, it seems to me that he's handed something, he's given a vision, but it doesn't register with him quite until many years later. And then he begins to realize how important it is. People have suggested that vision was fake, even though you have Sidney Rigdon saying he saw it too. But people have suggested, well, he actually stole the idea from Thomas Dick's book, Philosophy of a Future State, or from Emanuel Swedenborg, good Swedish guy. But there he would be working through to something. He'd be studying it out and then writing it out. I'd expect it to show up in his thought, but instead it's something that's handed to him from the outside. Likewise, the Book of Mormon. He'd grown up in a Bible-saturated culture, but he didn't know the Book of Mormon as well. He translated it really intensively for about 2 months, but he doesn't cite it much after that. Occasionally, but not as much as you might think. That to me suggests it came from outside him. All right. David Whitmer said in his pamphlet that Joseph Smith was a fallen prophet. He said Joseph Smith seems to change revelations later on, including adding the restoration of the priesthood. Why should we believe his Book of Mormon witness but reject his testimony that Joseph was fallen? Okay, I'll tell you why. If you had a case where you had someone standing on a street corner and he saw an accident, and there's an auto accident, and he's called in to testify in court about what happened. What is really important is what he saw. He's important as a witness. He has unique authority as an eyewitness to something that he saw. Now, if he starts telling you what his opinion is of Volvos as opposed to Volkswagens or something like that, we don't care. He has no specific authority for that. He has authority for what he saw, which he uniquely saw. David Whitmer's authority as a witness is really important. He's an eyewitness to something, and he testifies that he saw it. His theological ideas, he has no more authority than anybody else. They're his opinions. Now, some of what he says is actually probably untrue, but some of it is true. Joseph Smith did feel that as he was revising a revelation for publication, he could add things because he had written the revelation in the first place. Revelation comes to him again, inspiration. He modifies things. He changes things to express his thought. He's trying, in most cases, to convey his inspiration in the best language he can find. David Whitmer seems to have taken, if I may use the term, a more fundamentalist approach to things. Once a revelation was written, it ought never to be changed. And so his comment later on is that the church, he didn't leave the church, he says the church left him. But where he's really important is as an eyewitness, and he never yields from that. He disagreed with Joseph on many later issues. They had fights, but he never backs away from his testimony. In some ways, that makes his testimony even more impressive to me, that he has no particular reason to say Joseph Smith was a true prophet, but he says he was. Now, his opinion is that Joseph goes off the rails later on. He makes mistakes. We can disagree about that. I disagree with David Whitmer on that. But as an eyewitness, I respect him, and I think they're quite different things. I may be interested in hearing what you saw when you went to a certain place. I'm much less interested in your political opinions, probably. But if you say you saw something amazing, then I want you to tell me about it. What did you see? So I don't know if that made sense, but that would be my view. Okay, I think that covers everything. I've answered all of the questions, maybe poorly, but I have answered them. So I'm happy to talk with anybody afterwards. But again, it seems to, I will say this in closing. I have tried really hard to construct an alternative explanation of the Book of Mormon. I thought, okay, I need to be fair here. Could I explain it in a secular way? And my answer is no, I can't. I can explain bits and pieces of it. I can explain away certain things, but I can't explain it all. And sometimes my explanation for this, my hypothetical explanation, absolutely contradicts something else over here. I can't come up with a story that will explain it away. And so I'm left to say, I don't have faith strong enough to believe in the critics' view of the Book of Mormon. I'm just a simple guy who only has enough faith to go with Joseph Smith. I can't buy the stories that Dan Vogel tells, for example, to pick one particular person. And so I'm left, apart from spiritual witness, which I have had, I'm left as an academic looking at the Book of Mormon's story and Joseph Smith's story and saying, I just can't imagine how he did it. If he did it, I don't see how. The book is too remarkable, written, dictated too rapidly. It's too rich and too complex. There are too many witnesses that I can't explain away. People who are seeing things with him. It's one thing for Joseph to be hallucinating, but can you really get 11 or 12 or 15 other people to hallucinate with him? I don't know how. I wouldn't know how to do that. To see the same things, hear the same things. So for me, the best explanation of the Book of Mormon is that it is what Joseph Smith says it is, and to draw the conclusion. If the Book of Mormon is true, then Joseph Smith is a prophet. But even more importantly than that, if the Book of Mormon is true, then Jesus is the Christ. There is a God in heaven. He does care about us. He sent his Son to atone for our sins. I bear you my testimony again that that's true in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.